Justin Podur is a professor at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. His undergraduate degree was in physics, where he worked as a summer student on a project analyzing atmospheric radiation. He has published in journals including Ecological Modeling, Ecological Applications, and International Journal of Wildland Fire, including studies modeling future forest fire scenarios under climate change.
Thank you. So, I considered talking about atmospheric radiation, emission, decomposition of the atmosphere, but really, I don't think that would make for a very fun evening. Maybe it would for some of you. It would certainly be fun for me. But let me talk to you instead about why we have the confidence that we do in the science that we have. When we talk about something like, a scientific claim like, if we burn all of there was a relatively recent study that came out that said, if we were to burn all of the fossil fuel that we have access to, we would reach, these thresholds of mass extinction and melt all the methane in the polar, in the tundra region and the polar ice, melt the polar ice cap and so on. So all of these, these are predictions that scientists make, and so what are these based on? Why should we have as much confidence in these claims or predictions as we do? And what I want to convey is that climate science, scientists have a very particular way of working and a very particular culture, especially when they're talking not to each other but to the public. And scientists don't like to make claims confidently. They like to say only what they can say. They like to say it very precisely. And as a result, that can come across as sounding like they have less confidence in their findings than they actually do. And ultimately, I think it comes across as us having less confidence in these scientific results than we actually do. And that's been very useful to Stephen Harper and to the people that are the fossil fuel lobbies to say, look, these scientists don't talk very confidently. They talk about uncertainty. They talk about ranges of possibilities. They talk about ranges of different scenarios. Why should we believe them when if we take any kind of action on it, it'll cost all these jobs? The truth is, climate science is based on a very solid footing. So this climate science is actually not, it's not really at the forefront of scientific theory or theorizing. I have friends that I studied physics with were working on string theory. I have other friends who were doing biophysics and who are now working in a lab where they're changing cell lines, so they can actually change a skin cell into a bone cell. Like, those are extraordinary scientific advances, and they're creating the theory as they go to do these things. As far as the climate science that we use to describe what's happening in the atmosphere, these are observations that go back many decades. We have an instrumental record that goes back many decades for temperature. We have measurements and experiments about how gases in the atmosphere, the gases that occur in the atmosphere, the experiments are done typically down here, not out there. But we know a lot about how gases absorb and emit radiation. Again, experiments that go back many decades, and theories about gases that go back to the 19th century and are completely sound. So when you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, these are not it's not like you're going to Nature or Science or one of these scientific journals and reading something that's at the cutting edge, or going to a conference and reading something that's at the cutting edge. These are not that kind of document. The IPCC documents are consensus documents. They are incredibly careful to say things that are just completely, I don't want to say banal, but that's almost, you know, the word to describe it. It's something that everybody knows, everybody expects, and it's minimalist. And that's why every time a new IPCC report comes out, the predictions are, it's much worse than we said last time. And it's an artifact of the way they put it together. There's a conservative bias in the reports because they don't want to make alarmist claims, so they make conservative claims. And inevitably, every time they update their work, the new observations are that things have gotten worse. Things have gone beyond their predictions. When we talk about the climate, we're talking about a complex system. And you know, you've all heard of this idea that if a butterfly flaps its wings in Thailand, it causes a hurricane in the Caribbean or something. And the reason for that is that it's called in mathematics, there's a sensitivity to initial conditions. I'm sure you've heard the character from Jurassic Park talking about this. But in a complex system, if there's many variables and they all interact with one another, then a small change in one of the variables will propagate out and cause potentially big changes later. The thing is, it's a complex system, but it's still physics. And the reason physics is we're able to make predictions using actual equations in physics, and we're able to do so much in physics that we're, you know, only recently able to do in other sciences, is precisely because we're isolating variables. We're looking at simple systems. So it's complex from a mathematical perspective. It's difficult to understand mathematically, but as far as the system goes, it's far simpler than a biological system or an ecological system, and it's far simpler than a social system. So the idea, the reason I say this is because there is absolutely no comparison between the confidence that we have as a society about the claims that we're hearing in the IPCC reports about the climate, and the confidence of the politicians that make predictions about what these policies, what good climate policy would do to the economy. The economy is, compared to the climate, vastly more complex, vastly more unpredictable. And as a social construction, which is what an economy is, it's actually amenable to decisions and policy and management or adjustment and politics. And we could vote, we could make decisions collectively about what we want to do in the economy. We can't actually do that. We can't vote and decide on what the temperature is going to be tomorrow. That's a physical system that constrains what we can do socially. So the reason that politicians can say this is going to cost 250,000 jobs or whatever is precisely because they don't have a scientific basis to make that claim. They're really just they're just saying a number. It doesn't have any meaning behind it. And so the confidence of that conservative politician looks like it's really based on something compared to the kind of cagey, careful, qualified statements of a scientist. But in fact, it's the exact opposite of what's going on. The politician has nothing behind what he's saying. The scientist has a gigantic body of evidence and theory going back decades. So, in order for something to be scientifically sound, then I would say I don't think it has to be it doesn't actually have to meet the high bar of climate science. It actually just has to have a few criteria. In order to be scientific, in order to kind of use a scientific method, you basically have to be explicit about your assumptions, you have to have evidence for your claims, and you have to have consistency. So in the climate context, that means, you know, if you put a column of carbon dioxide in a container and you watch what happens with the radiation, if another person does the same experiment, they should get the same result, and they do. That's scientific consistency. And so you can make relatively more or less scientific predictions about things like the economy. That's not often done, but it's possible to do. And when we talk about sciences like ecology, which is where a lot of the predictions about extinction and a lot of the other problems associated with rising temperatures come from, ecological science is not on that same solid theoretical footing. Ecology is one of those more cutting-edge sciences where we're figuring things out and we're building the theory as we go. But there is some theory, there are some things we talk about in ecology that are particularly important to the climate issue. One is the idea of disturbances and the idea of threshold effects. So in an ecosystem, which is a set of organisms or populations that interact with one another, they have predator-prey interactions, competitive interactions. In an ecosystem, you can get a disturbance, a fire coming through, or a hurricane, or any kind of, you know, a perturbation, an asteroid falling, something. In such an ecosystem, you can have a disturbance, and that could be part of an ecosystem. Some disturbances are part of an ecological functioning. So the boreal forest, for example, has fires. Periodic fires are part of what happens in the boreal forest. The species of the boreal forest are adapted to fire. The same goes for the prairies. They're adapted to fire. But if you change the frequency, the intensity, the rate of disturbances, you may have what's called a threshold effect. So if you have lots and lots, if you have much more fire because there are higher temperatures and drier periods, which is what our models do predict, if you have progressively more fires, you may end up not having a forest anymore. It may eventually become a fire-adapted grassland. So that threshold effect leads to a change of state, and that is what, you know, that's what keeps all these scientists up at night when they're looking at the ecology and the ecological effects of climate change. The other side of that is resilience, and again, all of these things have some kind of metaphorical connection to society, right? Society is a kind of an ecosystem. We are organisms. We interact with one another and with our environment. We interact with other species and with the environment. So thinking of society as an ecosystem, thinking of the disturbances that will be caused by climate change is a useful way to think. As an environmentalist, I definitely would argue that's a useful way to think. The other side of that is resilience. So, you know, ecosystems that function well and are healthy can have more resilience, so they can handle disturbances and recover from disturbances in a way that more vulnerable ecosystems can't. If you've had too many shocks in the past, then it's harder to recover. So that kind of resilience is something that I think we can build as a matter of social action and political action. I did want to mention, you know, I know Carolyn's going to talk about these kinds of issues as well, but, you know, the LEAP manifesto that was launched, you know, Martin Lukács had an article in The Guardian where he said, you know, why are these politicians more upset about the possibility of rising wages than they are about the possibility of rising sea levels, right? And I think that's the kind of thinking about the difference between a physical system and social change that I think we should be doing more of. And just to conclude, I wanted to say that social systems and social change, not social change, let's just say the social system and the economic system have a range of impacts on the physical world and the ecosystems on which our life and our society depends. And I think it's worth mentioning that the climate isn't our only problem. And the reason I have to mention this, Naomi Klein's book has a chapter on geoengineering. So I think that the idea is, oh, okay, well you have a problem with climate change. Well, that's okay. We'll just inject sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to block some of the sun's rays, and then that'll solve your little climate problem and create profits and all kinds of wonderful capitalist side effects. So that's not a good way to think about it, because it's kind of isolating a problem that's actually a bigger social problem, which is capitalism and the idea that we can do whatever we want technologically and socially and not have any consequences for the ecosystem. So there's geoengineering, there's the possibility, there's all kinds of nuclear problems, which is another, like environmentalists have also gone in that direction where they say, oh, okay, you're worried about climate change, you want the tar sands to stay or to close, then obviously you have to support nukes. So we have a campaigner who was passing around a flyer about how nukes are not the answer, and I think I have to agree. There's also, there's soil loss, there's colony collapse disorder from bees, there's the potential of fisheries collapsing, there's oceans that are being polluted. So there's a wide range of things that could get us unless we change the way that the system operates and the way that we think about the relationship between society, the economy, capitalism, and nature. And I think that the last point I just want to make is all of these things, that Andrew describes in his book and that Andrew was talking about, everything that Harper has done in the past few years, or the past 10 years, depends on scientific literacy being perpetually lower. And that there's a deliberate attack on scientific literacy as well. So the idea that you can't trust the science. Science is not something you can have confidence in. And it's been deliberately undermined. And Andrew, you mentioned something really interesting, that no oil exporter has ever made a transition to renewables, and I thought that was fascinating because I was thinking that it's the oil exporters that are actually attacking science and scientific literacy. So like I taught in 2008, I taught in Pakistan a course on critical thinking, and I remember thinking like everything, so much that was bad that was happening in Pakistan ultimately can be traced to money from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is about to execute some young man by crucifixion, and Harper's negotiating a secret deal with, I think, somebody, with the Saudis right now, with the Saudi regime right now. And I just see this like what Harper's been doing in the past 10 years has been to kind of take Canada in that kind of Saudi kingdom direction, like hating science, removing democratic constraints on their, whatever, freedom of action, undermining climate agreements. And so there is an attack on science that I think is always a part of this. And I don't think anything good can come out of dismissing science, but I do think that if there's one thing that's come out that's good about the attack on science and scientists here, it's been that, hopefully more people might realize that the place of science is not with the elite, but it's more, the place of science is with the people and as a tool of the people. So I hope that you can think of science that way. You can think of scientists that way. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great.